Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. This summary diagram was included in the 2018 National Climate Assessment. It includes all kinds of misinformation, but the part I'm interested in for this video is U.S. wildfires. The graph showed a sharp increase in burn acreage in the United States since 1983. And if you plot atmospheric carbon dioxide levels on the same plot as U.S. burn acreage, there appears to be a correlation. The U.S. government wants people to believe that the burning of fossil fuels is causing more forest fires in the United States. But we might ask, why did they start their data set in 1983? We have data going back a lot further than that. Here's a 1938 article from the New York Times. Forest fires, one every 3 minutes in 1937, burned almost 22 million acres. And they said the burn acreage a year earlier in 1936 was almost double what it was in 1937. The U.S. Forest Service has burn acreage data going back over a century. And it shows exactly what the New York Times reported. 22 million acres burned in 1937 and almost double that in 1936. As of January 29, 2021, 1 week into Biden's occupation of the White House, the National Interagency Fire Center showed data all the way back to 1926. And they showed the same burn acreage for 1937 as was in the New York Times article from 1938. Forest fires used to burn a lot more of the United States than they do now, and this is very inconvenient data for people pushing climate alarm. Biden was only in the White House for a few weeks when the data prior to 1983 was deleted from the National Interagency Fire Center website. 1983 had the lowest burn acreage on record. By starting the graph at the lowest year in 1983, there appears to be an upwards trend in burn acreage which correlates with CO2. But if we include the entire fire data set going back to 1926, we see there's no correlation at all between CO2 and burn acreage. In fact, they go the opposite direction. And we can also see that the upwards trend since 1983 is pretty much meaningless in the larger picture. By deleting the data prior to 1983, the Biden administration is once again defrauding the public about climate. And as bad as the story already is, it actually gets much worse. As of 2 days before the 2020 election, this document was on the National Interagency Fire Center website, and it had been there for a very long time. It showed that burn acreage in the United States was down 95% from the pre-industrial era. So when carbon dioxide levels were very low, below 280 parts per million, there was more than 140 million acres burned in the United States every year on average. But now at higher levels of CO2, burn acreage is down more than 90%. This document was extremely inconvenient, so the Biden administration did exactly what you'd expect them to do. They deleted it. And they attached this very cynical message to the page which comes up when you try to access that URL. They said, the National Interagency Fire Center is committed to making its information and communication technologies accessible to individuals with disabilities. But they did the exact opposite. They made the data inaccessible to everybody, and they attempted to hide their malfeasance behind a platitude about individuals with disabilities. These people in the Biden administration have no integrity, they have no ethics, and they have no shame. I'm going to finish this up with a New York Times article from 30 years ago. Researchers discovered that major conflagrations of fire sweeping across many mountain ranges in California and the Southwest were a common feature occurring at least twice a decade and apparently linked to oceanic currents much further south, the so-called La Niña events that often result in droughts. Finding this synchronicity in fire events was a big surprise to us, he said. It tells me that western landscapes in pre-settlement era were very smoky places. 30 years ago, the New York Times knew that California droughts were associated with La Niña events, like the one which has been occurring for the last 3 years. And they also knew that there used to be a lot more burn acreage in the western United States than there is now. 30 years ago, the New York Times occasionally did actual reporting. But those days are long gone. Now it's all fake news all the time. The New York Times now calls wildfires climate change and says they're caused by the burning of fossil fuels. It's unfortunate that current New York Times writers don't seem to know anything about the history of their own newspaper. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this massive fraud from Democrats in the press for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.